In the steel and glass heart of Chicago, where legacies were forged in concrete and fortunes traded on the whisper of a zoning variance, a deal that was to be the capstone of a legendary career was crumbling into dust. Inside the hushed panoramic dining room of the Pinnacle, perched atop the city like a modern-day Olympus, billionaire developer Eleanor Vance felt the cold grip of a terror she hadn't experienced since her first solo business loan 30 years ago. Her guest, an Italian count of immense wealth and impeccable lineage, was looking at his watch, a gesture more fatal than any spoken word. Her indispensable executive assistant, the keeper of her schedule, her secrets and her sanity, was unreachable. Her empire, Vance Sterling Properties, was balanced on the precipice of a cultural chasm. A few feet away, refilling their water glasses with a practiced, silent grace, was a young waitress named Clara. To the titans at the table, she was a ghost in a starched black uniform, a functional piece of the opulent scenery. They had no idea they were looking at the one person in the city of Chicago who held the key. What she was about to do wouldn't just salvage a deal, it would shatter the foundations of their world and expose a truth that would change all their lives forever. The air in the private dining room, a glass box suspended 70 floors above the glittering grid of the city, was thick with the scent of seared scallops, aged Barolo, and the acrid tang of pure, unadulterated panic. At the head of the table sat Eleanor Vance, the Ice Queen of Illinois, a woman whose steely gaze had made mayors tremble and rival developers capitulate. Tonight, that legendary composure was a fragile veneer over a maelstrom of anxiety. The knot in her stomach was tighter than the pearls at her throat. Across from her sat Count Allaramo Bellini, the last of a noble Florentine line. He was not just a potential partner, he was the gatekeeper. The deal on the table was for the Ethelgard estate, a sprawling historic property north of the city that Eleanor coveted with an obsessive passion. It was to be the site of her magnum opus, a revolutionary blend of architectural preservation and sustainable community living. It was her legacy, and it was all dissolving like an Alka-Seltzer in a glass. The catastrophe was simple, yet absolute. Maria, her executive assistant of 15 years, was gone. Not late, vanished. 2 hours ago, a single cryptic text had arrived. Family emergency. Unreachable. All notes in the Bellini file. But the file, a meticulously compiled dossier on the Count's tastes, passions, and psychological triggers, was on Maria's encrypted laptop, and Maria was not answering her phone. Eleanor was flying blind. Beside her, her senior vice president, Garrett Shaw, a man whose ambition was matched only by the gloss on his Italian loafers, was attempting to fill the void with a slick barrage of financial projections and tax incentive data. He was a shark, and he only knew how to speak to other sharks. He did not know how to speak to a man whose family had been patrons of the arts since the Renaissance. As you can see, Count, Garrett purred, gesturing to his tablet, the IRR on this project is projected at 22% over 5 years. It's an unprecedented return for a property of this nature. Count Bellini offered a smile so thin it could have cut glass. Mr. Shaw, he said, his English precise and melodic like a cello, my family has owned land for 700 years. We do not measure our legacy in fiscal quarters. He took a delicate sip of wine, his gaze drifting out the window to the city below. Your modern cities, so much glass, so little soul. The word reschedule hung unspoken in the air, a death sentence to the deal. The Count was returning to Florence on a private jet at dawn. Rescheduling was a confession of incompetence, an insult to a man of his stature. It would give her blood rival, a corporate raider named Silas Blackwood, the opening he needed to swoop in. Eleanor had heard the rumors. Blackwood had been trying to get a meeting with the Count for weeks. This dinner was her only shot. The soul of the project, Count, Eleanor interjected, her voice a practiced, calm alto that belied the frantic screaming in her mind, is in its vision. We intend to honor the estate's history while creating a model for future living. It was corporate jargon, hollow and meaningless, and they both knew it. The polite, almost imperceptible arch of the Count's eyebrow confirmed it. Men like Bellini valued authenticity above all else. A failure this profound was a mortal sin. Garrett, sensing the disaster, leaned in to whisper, "Eleanor, we're bleeding out. He thinks we're just American Philistines. We need Maria's notes. Without the personal angle, we're dead." "Then find one," Eleanor hissed back, a thin sheen of sweat forming on her temples. It was in this suffocating tableau of failure that Clara Rossi moved through the room. To Eleanor and Garrett, she was a non-entity, a pair of hands that refilled glasses and cleared plates. She moved with an efficiency born of 1,000 shifts, her steps silent on the plush carpet. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her face was a mask of professional neutrality. But behind that mask, Clara was an ocean of observation. She didn't just hear their words. She understood the dissonant music of the conversation. She saw the desperation in the billionaire's eyes and the bored contempt in the nobleman's. As she reached for the Count's bread plate, he murmured a quiet, reflexive "grazie" without looking at her. Clara paused, a flicker of something crossing her features. "Prego," she replied softly, the Italian flowing from her with a natural, unstudied accent. The Count's head lifted. He looked at her, truly saw her, for the first time. He saw a young woman, perhaps 22, with intelligent, weary eyes. The moment of connection was brief, a spark in the dark, and then it was gone. He was a count. She was a waitress. He inclined his head politely and turned back to the conversation, which had now stalled into a grim, terminal silence. Clara retreated to a discreet corner near the service station, her heart thumping. The Italian had slipped out, a ghost of a life she thought she had buried. She watched the train wreck continue. Garrett was now attempting to compliment the Count on his watch, misidentifying a rare Patek Philippe as a Rolex. The gaffe was colossal, a cultural pratfall of epic proportions. Clara felt a pang of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, a mix of furious frustration and a wild, terrifying glimmer of opportunity. She knew this man's world, not because she belonged to it, but because she had studied it, loved it, and had been on the verge of making it her own. She had spent 3 years of her life not just learning Italian, but mastering the history of Italian art and architecture, from Palladio to piano. It was part of a life where she wasn't Clara the waitress, but Clara the brilliant architecture student at the University of Chicago, the one who was supposed to be in Rome right now on a prestigious fellowship. But life had a brutal way of rewriting futures. Her grandfather, a proud Italian immigrant and a master carpenter, had suffered a debilitating fall at a non-union construction site. The company fought the claim, and the mountain of legal and medical bills had shattered their family's modest savings. Her dreams had been sacrificed one by one to pay for his round-the-clock care. She'd been forced to drop out of her program, trading her drafting table and textbooks for an apron and a tray. Now her world was this room, serving people like Eleanor Vance, people who built the world she could now only dream of inhabiting. The Count was placing his napkin on the table, the universal signal for surrender. The deal was collapsing, and she was the only person in the room who understood the language that could save it. The question, a thunderclap in her mind, was whether she had the courage to speak it. The atmosphere in the room had curdled from strained to funereal. Count Bellini, having endured Garrett's clumsy flattery, placed his silver fork and knife together on his plate with a delicate finality. The soft click of metal on porcelain was as loud as a guillotine's release. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice laced with a polite, dismissive chill, "I thank you for a filling meal. However, it is clear our philosophies are not aligned. Your vision is for a spreadsheet. I am seeking a sonnet. I fear we have wasted each other's time." This was it. The end. Eleanor felt a wave of cold dread. She saw the Ethelgard estate bulldozed by Silas Blackwood and turned into another soulless McMansion subdivision. She saw her legacy, her dream, turning to ash. She was about to offer a final, groveling apology when a quiet voice sliced through the tension. "Forgive my presumption, sir." Every head in the room swiveled. It was the waitress, Clara. She stood by the table, her hands clasped respectfully before her, her posture straight, her gaze fixed not on Eleanor, but on the Count. Garrett scoffed, his face flushing with indignation. What is the meaning of this? Get back to the kitchen before I have you fired. Eleanor was about to wave her away, furious at this bizarre and unprofessional interruption, but she was stopped by the look on Count Bellini's face. The boredom was gone. His gaze was locked on Clara, a flicker of the recognition she'd seen earlier now fanned into a flame of intense curiosity. He remembered her, the girl with the perfect Florentine accent. You have something to say, miss? The Count prompted, his voice inviting her to continue. Clara took a deep, steadying breath. Every nerve ending screamed at her to apologize and vanish. This was not her place. These were gods on Olympus, and she was a mortal who had wandered into their midst. But then she caught her own reflection in the panoramic window, a faint ghost against the city lights, the tired eyes, the drab uniform, and a lifetime of suppressed ambition ignited within her. This was her one shot, not just to save their deal, but to save herself from a life of silent invisibility. She addressed Count Bellini directly, speaking in flawless, formal Italian. Her words weren't the stilted phrases of a tourist, but the fluid, nuanced language of an educated native, weaving in complex architectural terms. Conte Bellini, lei ha parlato di anima, di sonetti in pietra. Perdonatemi, ma quello che vedo nel progetto della signora Vance non è un foglio di calcolo, ma una tela vuota. L'anima non è nella terra, ma in ciò che vi si costruisce. Lei ha menzionato Palladio. La sua Villa Capra non era forse, ai suoi tempi, una radicale dichiarazione di modernità, che onorava però le forme classiche? Count Bellini, you spoke of soul, of sonnets in stone. Forgive me, but what I see in Mrs. Vance's project is not a spreadsheet, but a blank canvas. The soul is not in the land, but in what is built upon it. You mentioned Palladio. Was his Villa Capra not, in its day, a radical statement of modernity that still honored classical forms? The effect was instantaneous, a shockwave that rattled the room. Garrett and Eleanor sat dumbfounded, their faces masks of utter confusion. But on the other side of the table, the Count's demeanor had undergone a seismic shift. His languid indifference had vanished, replaced by a sharp, electrified focus. He leaned forward, his eyes, which had been hooded and distant, now wide with disbelief and delight. Eleanor found her voice first, a harsh whisper. What in God's name did you just say to him? Clara turned to her, her expression calm but resolute. I apologize for interrupting, Mrs. Vance, and then I suggested that true architectural soul lies not just in preservation, but in bold, forward-thinking vision that respects the past. I compared your Ethelgard project to the work of Andrea Palladio. The Count responded to Clara, a torrent of rapid, passionate Italian, his hands gesturing as if he were shaping a building from the air itself. He challenged her, questioned her, tested the depth of her knowledge. He asked about the principles of Venetian Gothic, about the use of light in the work of Carlo Scarpa. Without missing a beat, Clara answered him, her replies as knowledgeable and passionate as his questions. She parried his every query, not just with facts, but with insight. It was not a conversation, it was a duet. She spoke of how the Ethelgard project could incorporate Scarpa's philosophy of layering history, of letting the old breathe within the new. Garrett tugged at Eleanor's sleeve, his whisper frantic. Eleanor, what is happening? Who is this woman? I have no idea, Eleanor breathed, her eyes locked on Clara. The timid waitress had evaporated. In her place stood a poised, articulate, and fiercely intelligent young woman. It was like watching a sparrow transform into an eagle in the middle of a hurricane. Finally, Count Bellini fell silent. He gazed at Clara for a long moment, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face for the first time all evening. Then he turned to Eleanor. Mrs. Vance, he said in English, a newfound warmth and profound respect in his voice. It seems you have been concealing your most valuable asset. He then gestured to the empty chair beside him, the one Garrett had so ineptly occupied moments before. Miss Rossi, Clara supplied softly. Clara Rossi. Miss Rossi, the Count said, with a deep formal nod that was a universe away from his earlier dismissal. Please, join us. The walk from the service station to the mahogany table felt like crossing the Rubicon. The eyes of Eleanor Vance and Garrett Shaw burned into her back, a mixture of incandescent shock and dawning bewilderment. Her apron suddenly felt absurd, a relic from a life that had just ended. With hands that trembled only slightly, she untied it, folded it with the same precision she used for napkins, and placed it on a nearby sideboard. It was a quiet act of abdication and anointment. She took the seat the Count had offered. The supple leather was a world away from the cracked vinyl of the employee bus seat she rode home on every night. The table was no longer a workstation. It was her stage. Eleanor Vance stared at her, her mind struggling to reboot. Her VP, Garrett, looked as though Clara had just levitated. "Miss Rossi," Eleanor began, her voice tight, controlled. "Perhaps you could explain what is happening." "The Count and I were discussing architectural philosophy," Clara said calmly, addressing Eleanor, but keeping her posture oriented toward the Count, a subtle acknowledgement of where the power in the room now lay. Specifically, how a modern development can be a dialogue with history rather than a monologue of glass and steel. Garrett snorted, a desperate attempt to reclaim his authority. "And you learned that where? At Waitress school?" Before Clara could form a reply, the Count interjected, speaking to her again in Italian, his tone sharp and probing. She listened, her brow furrowed in concentration, then turned to translate for Eleanor's benefit. "The Count's primary concern is not financial, but spiritual. He fears the Ethelgard Manor, a building he considers a piece of American history, will be relegated to a mere clubhouse in a sea of sterile condominiums. He feels that would be a desecration of its legacy." Eleanor's heart sank. This was the core of it, the emotional obstacle her team of analysts and lawyers could never quantify. It was a problem of art and soul, and she had come armed only with spreadsheets. "Tell him," Eleanor said slowly, her mind racing, "that we will preserve the manor meticulously. We've budgeted $7 million for its restoration alone." Clara nodded, but as she turned back to the Count, she did something extraordinary. She did not merely translate Eleanor's words. She transformed them. Instead of presenting the $7 million as a line item on a budget, she framed it as a sacred trust. She spoke in Italian, her voice resonating with a passion that was both personal and professional. "Il Conte, la signora Vance, non le offre semplicemente del denaro. Le offre una promessa. $7 milioni non per una ristrutturazione, ma per una resurrezione. Per assumere i migliori artigiani, per riscoprire le tecniche originali, per far sì che la casa Ethelgard non sia un museo, ma che canti di nuovo la sua storia." The Count, Mrs. Vance, is not merely offering you money. She is offering a promise. $7 million not for a renovation, but for a resurrection. To hire the finest artisans, to rediscover the original techniques, to ensure the Ethelgard Manor is not a museum, but that it sings its history once more. She used the word resurrezione, resurrection, a powerful evocative term that elevated the act from a commercial transaction to a spiritual undertaking. It was a nuance a professional translator would never have dared, but one that struck the Count with the force of a revelation. His chief aide, a severe-looking man who had remained silent all evening, responded animatedly in Italian, pointing to a clause in the proposal, his voice full of technical objections about public access and historical easements. Clara listened, her focus absolute, absorbing every detail. When he finished, she turned back to Eleanor. His advisor, Signor Valli, points to Clause 12C regarding public access. He argues that cordoning off the manor for the private use of residents betrays its historical significance as a community landmark. He sees it as privatization of a public treasure. She had not only translated the objection, but had also articulated the potent philosophical principle behind it. Garrett leaned towards Eleanor, whispering, "That's been a sticking point all along. Our legal team said it was a non-starter. The exclusivity of the manor is a key selling point for the condos." Eleanor felt a dizzying sense of displacement. For the past hour, she'd been the most powerful woman in the room and completely powerless. Now the nexus of control was this young woman she hadn't even bothered to look at. She glanced at the thick proposal, then at Clara. Her face was serene, illuminated by an intelligence and a profound analytical calm she had failed to see. "All right," Eleanor said, a new tone in her voice, one of respect that stunned Garrett into silence. "Miss Rossi, Clara, ask him what he would propose." Clara relayed the question. A lively, intense debate erupted between the Count and his aide. The funereal silence of the room was gone, replaced by the vibrant, crackling energy of a genuine negotiation. It was as if a dam of misunderstanding had burst, and communication was now flowing freely, all through the conduit of this astonishing waitress. Finally, the Count outlined a counter-proposal. Clara translated, her voice clear and precise. The Count proposes a compromise. The manor and its immediate gardens will be owned and maintained by the new development, but they will be established as a charitable trust, open to the public 6 days a month. Furthermore, he suggests that a portion of the residence be converted into an artist-in-residence fellowship, funded by a percentage of the homeowners' association fees. He believes this would ensure the estate remains a living, breathing part of the community's cultural life, not just a gated relic. Eleanor's mind whirled. It was audacious. It was complicated. It would require a complete rethinking of their financial model. It was also brilliant. It didn't just solve a problem. It created a story, a unique selling proposition that would set the Ethelgard project apart from anything else on the market. It gave the project the one thing she hadn't been able to buy, a soul. "What do you think?" Eleanor asked. The question directed not at her senior VP or her invisible team of lawyers, but at the young woman in the simple black dress. Clara hesitated, visibly startled by the question. Eleanor Vance was asking her for business advice. She looked at the faces around the table. The hopeful, engaged Italians, Garrett, stupefied and resentful, and Eleanor herself, her Ice Queen facade melted away, leaving only a raw, pragmatic hunger for a solution. She took a breath and gave her honest, unfiltered assessment. "Mrs. Vance, it's a masterstroke. It turns a legal liability into a core brand identity. It generates immeasurable goodwill and press. It will attract buyers who aren't just looking for luxury, but for a sense of meaning and community. It's not a concession, it's an upgrade. I believe it's the key that unlocks the entire deal." Eleanor Vance, the Titan of Chicago, the woman who built her empire on trusting no one's gut but her own, looked at the waitress who had served her wine an hour ago. She saw no flicker of doubt in her eyes, only the crystalline certainty of a born strategist. She let out a long, slow breath she didn't realize she'd been holding for 2 hours. "Tell Count Bellini he has a deal." The moment Clara translated Eleanor's acceptance, the room seemed to exhale. The charged tension of the negotiation dissipated, replaced by a wave of palpable relief and burgeoning excitement. Count Bellini rose, his face wreathed in a genuine, magnanimous smile, and extended his hand to Eleanor. As they shook, sealing a pact worth hundreds of millions of dollars, the room erupted in a flurry of activity. Lawyers were discreetly summoned, Garrett was dispatched to arrange for champagne, and the Count's aide was already making annotations to the contract on a tablet. Through it all, Clara was the calm eye of the hurricane. She facilitated the final points of clarification, translating complex legal and architectural terms back and forth with a fluency that had Eleanor's newly arrived legal counsel staring in slack-jawed admiration. She navigated the delicate cultural dance of closing the deal, ensuring both sides felt that they had achieved a profound victory. When the champagne arrived, it was the Count who poured the first glass, not for Eleanor, but for Clara. He raised his flute in a toast. "To Miss Rossi," he declared, his voice resonating through the room, "a true architetto di ponti, an architect of bridges. Mrs. Vance, you are a very, very wise woman to have such a person in your council." Eleanor, her face flushed with a mixture of champagne and dizzying relief, looked at Clara, who had instinctively retreated toward the edge of the room, as if ready to fade back into her role as a waitress. "Don't worry, Count," Eleanor said, her eyes locked on Clara with an intensity that made the young woman's heart race. "I'm only just beginning to realize how wise." Eventually, the celebratory buzz subsided. The Italians departed, promising a swift finalization of the paperwork. Eleanor's lawyer, still looking shell-shocked, left with a final admiring glance at Clara. Garrett, after being pointedly ignored by both Eleanor and the Count for the last hour, had vanished in a cloud of bruised ego. Finally, only Eleanor and Clara remained in the vast, silent dining room, surrounded by the glittering detritus of a meal that had changed the course of a company. Eleanor walked over to where Clara stood, a strange expression on her face, a mix of exhaustion, exhilaration, and profound curiosity. "I don't know whether to thank you or to demand you submit to a background check," Eleanor began, her voice softer, more human, than Clara had ever imagined it could be. "Thank you isn't a big enough word. You didn't just save a deal tonight, Miss Rossi. You saved my legacy." "I was just glad I could help, Mrs. Vance," Clara said quietly, her adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving a trembling exhaustion in its wake. Eleanor shook her head. "No, that was more than help. That was a virtuoso performance. The architectural knowledge, the cultural fluency, the word resurrection. Where did that come from?" "The Count said you spoke with a Florentine accent." This was the moment of reckoning. Clara took a steadying breath and decided that the truth, in all its unvarnished, painful detail, was the only currency she had left. "My grandfather is from Florence, Mrs. Vance," she said, her gaze direct and unwavering. "I grew up listening to his stories, and I was in the master's program for architectural history at the University of Chicago. My focus was on the Italian Renaissance." Eleanor's carefully sculpted eyebrows shot up. "The University of Chicago? Their architecture program is world-class. What happened?" Clara's professional mask crumbled, revealing the weary, burdened young woman beneath. "Life happened, Mrs. Vance. My grandfather, he was a carpenter. There was an accident on a job site 2 years ago. A bad one. The medical bills, they wiped us out. I had to drop out to work. I took this job, and another in the mornings, to pay for his care." She spoke without a trace of self-pity, stating the facts of her life as plainly as she had translated the clauses of the contract. The story hung in the air between them, a brutal counterpoint to the velvet-draped luxury of the room. Eleanor was silent for a long time. She was a woman who dealt in the quantifiable, the logical, the world of concrete and steel. She was now confronted with the messy, unfair, illogical reality of human struggle. She thought of her own trivial complaints, a delayed flight, a market downturn. They seemed obscene in the face of what this brilliant young woman had endured. A mind that should have been drafting blueprints for the future was instead memorizing the daily soup special. The sheer, staggering waste of it struck her with the force of a physical blow. She had built her empire on the principle of meritocracy, of finding and elevating the best talent. And the most formidable raw talent she had ever encountered was hiding in plain sight, buried under an avalanche of bad luck. "Your grandfather," Eleanor said, her voice thick with an emotion Clara couldn't quite identify. "What was his trade?" "He was a master carpenter," Clara said, a flicker of pride in her eyes. "He specialized in historical restoration. He could make new wood look like it had been there for centuries. He always said the secret was to respect the story the wood was trying to tell." Eleanor stared at her, a look of dawning comprehension on her face. It all clicked into place. The knowledge wasn't just academic, it was in her blood. The perfect synthesis of high-level theory from the university and the grounded hands-on respect for legacy from her grandfather. That's what she had seen tonight. That's what had saved her. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a severe, elegant black business card. "This is my private cell number," she said, handing it to Clara. "I'm not going to insult you by leaving a large tip. That would be an insult to both of us." Clara looked down at the card. The name Eleanor Vance was embossed in stark silver letters. It felt heavier than a brick of gold. "I want you to call this number at 9 a.m. tomorrow. We have things to discuss." "Discuss what, Mrs. Vance?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. A genuine, rare smile touched Eleanor's lips, transforming her severe features. "We're going to discuss your signing bonus. We're going to discuss a salary that will make your head spin. And we're going to discuss which department you'll be running. Clara Rossi, your career in the food service industry is officially and irrevocably over." Clara didn't sleep. She sat at the small, wobbly kitchen table in her cramped apartment, the single black business card illuminated by the streetlight filtering through the window. The evening replayed in her mind like a fever dream, a surreal blend of terror and triumph. Could it be real? Or would she wake up to the jarring buzz of her 5 a.m. alarm? The whole thing a cruel fantasy cooked up by an exhausted mind? The familiar specter of doubt whispered in her ear. Men and women like Eleanor Vance lived in a different cosmos. They were polite, they were grateful. But when the sun rose, they returned to their world of Ivy League credentials and established pedigrees. The idea of plucking a waitress from obscurity and handing her a position of power seemed like something out of a fairy tale, and Clara had stopped believing in those a long time ago. Then she thought of her grandfather, asleep in the small second bedroom, his breathing labored. She thought of the stack of unpaid bills on the counter, a silent, menacing tower of paper. She thought of the constant, grinding worry that was her life's background music. The thought of silencing that music, of telling her Nono that he never had to worry again, that his future was secure, was a light so blinding it burned away the shadows of her doubt. That thought gave her the steel she needed. At precisely 9 o'clock, her hands shaking so badly she had to dial the number twice, she made the call. It was answered on the first ring. Vance. The voice was brisk, all business, a world away from the woman in the restaurant. Mrs. Vance, Clara began, her own voice thin and reedy. It's Clara Rossi. There was a pause, and for a heart-stopping second, Clara thought she would hear a dial tone. Then the voice warmed instantly. Clara. Good. I was expecting your call. There's a car waiting for you downstairs. My office. 30 minutes. Clara glanced out her window. A gleaming black Lincoln Town car was idling at the curb, as out of place in her working-class neighborhood as a flamingo in a blizzard. The Vance Sterling Properties headquarters was not a building. It was a statement. A sleek, obsidian tower that seemed to defy gravity. It was a monument to Eleanor's will. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and contemporary art, filled with people who moved with the predatory grace of sharks. Dressed in her one good blazer and a pair of simple black slacks, Clara felt like a mouse in a lion's den. She was escorted directly to the penthouse floor. The elevator doors opened into Eleanor Vance's office, a space so vast and minimalist it felt more like an art gallery than a place of work. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of Chicago. Eleanor was standing by the window, a cup of coffee in her hand. Incredible, isn't it? She said, not turning around. I come up here to remind myself that from a certain height, even the first dawn of her new life broke not with a triumphant chorus, but with the quiet, pervasive hum of fear. The Lincoln Town car, a silent black vessel, ferried Clara across the invisible borders of the city, from the grit and resilience of her neighborhood to the stark geometric canyons of the Loop. The Vance Sterling headquarters was not a building, but an act of sheer will, a shard of smoked glass, an obsidian steel that pierced the sky, arrogantly confident of its place in the world. As Clara stepped into the lobby, a cavern of Italian marble and abstract art, she felt the crushing weight of its silence. It was the silence of money, a soundlessness so profound it seemed to absorb all lesser noises, the frantic beat of her own heart, the whisper of her inexpensive blazer against her blouse. Eleanor Vance's office was less a workspace and more a stratosphere. The city of Chicago sprawled below, a detailed map of a life Clara had once observed only from street level. Eleanor was not seated behind her vast, empty desk. She stood before a wall of monitors displaying a silent ballet of stock tickers and global news feeds. Good, you're here, she said without turning. The employment contract is on the desk. My legal team has vetted it. It's ironclad. The signing bonus will be wired to your account by noon. I've also taken the liberty of engaging the services of a premier elder care consultancy. They will contact you this afternoon to conduct a full needs assessment for your grandfather. All costs will be covered. It was an avalanche of solutions, a blitzkrieg of efficiency that left Clara breathless. The problems that had defined her existence for 2 years, the relentless, grinding anxiety of bills and care, were being dismantled in under 30 seconds by a woman who hadn't even turned to look at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Vance," Clara managed, her voice a thin thread in the cavernous room. I... I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Eleanor finally turned, her eyes as sharp and clear as the winter air outside. "Listen, this is your new reality. Problems are data points. Resources are tools. Emotion is a liability. You had a moment of brilliance in that restaurant, a perfect storm of knowledge, opportunity, and courage. Brilliance is a spark. Here we build engines. Your job is to turn that spark into a sustainable, repeatable process. Do you understand?" "I think so." "Good. Now for the hard part." Eleanor walked to her desk, gesturing for Clara to sit. The chair was a marvel of ergonomic design, yet Clara felt as if she were perched on the edge of a cliff. "This building is a shark tank. They smell blood in the water. To them, you are a novelty, a curiosity, the boss's pet project. They will be polite to your face. They will smile and offer to help. And behind your back, they will be laying traps, waiting for you to stumble. Garrett Shaw, in particular, will consider your very existence a personal affront. He believes he is my heir apparent." "What do I do?" Clara asked, the scale of the challenge threatening to swallow her whole. "You do not try to win them over," Eleanor stated, her voice devoid of warmth, but filled with a pragmatic intensity that was, in its own way, a form of support. "You do not seek their approval. Their respect is worthless. You make them need you. You become so indispensable to the success of the projects you touch that to obstruct you would be to sabotage themselves. Your first project, the Ethelgard estate, is your shield and your sword. The Count adores you. He will only deal with you. Use that. Learn the systems, learn the budget, learn the language of this place. The jargon is a wall they build to keep people out. Learn to speak it better than they do. Your office is on this floor. My executive assistant, Maria, yes, the very same, has been briefed. She will be your guide. She is the only person in this building, besides me, that you can trust implicitly." The next few weeks were a blur of managed disorientation. Clara was a ghost haunting the edges of her own new life. She sat in meetings where acronyms flew like bullets. EBITDA, IRR, CAPEX, FFE, a language as foreign as ancient Sumerian. Garrett would often pause, a wolfish grin playing on his lips, and ask, "Are you following this, Clara?" His condescension was a physical thing, a suffocating cloak. She answered him with quiet dignity. "Please continue. I'm taking notes and will review the terminology later." And she did. Her nights, once spent in exhausted sleep, were now filled with a feverish self-education. She consumed books on corporate finance, project management, and contract law. She watched online seminars, her laptop casting a pale blue glow in the darkness of her new, spacious apartment. An apartment she had moved into with her grandfather, whose bewildered joy was the fuel that kept her going. She treated the corporate world as she had treated Palladian architecture, as a complex system with its own history, rules, and aesthetic principles. Her first real battle was over the Ethelgard Manor's restoration. Garrett, overseeing the primary construction budget, presented a list of approved contractors for the historical preservation work. They were large, efficient firms known for speed and cost-effectiveness. Clara looked at the proposal in a conference room filled with men in identical gray suits. "These firms specialize in commercial retrofitting," she said, her voice steady. "They're not artisans. They'll use modern polymers and standardized millwork. It will look clean, but it will have no soul. It will betray the promise we made to the Count." Garrett leaned back in his chair, the picture of weary patience. "Clara, this is the real world. We have timelines, we have budgets. The Count's resurrection fantasy is lovely poetry, but we're building a multi-million-dollar development, not a museum exhibit. The buyers of the condos won't know the difference." "I will," Clara said simply, "and the Count will. And the story we tell about this project will be a lie." The tension in the room was electric. She was a director with no team, a leader with no followers, challenging a senior vice president in his own domain. "And what do you propose?" Garrett asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We find some 80-year-old man in a leather apron to whittle the balustrades by hand?" "Something like that," Clara replied, unfazed. She slid a thin folder across the table. I've spent the last 3 weeks sourcing independent artisans from across the Midwest, a family of stonemasons from Wisconsin who have worked on state capitol restorations, a master plasterer from Ohio who knows how to replicate 19th century ornamental ceiling work, a custom woodworking shop in rural Illinois run by a man who learned his trade from his father and grandfather. Garrett scoffed, flipping through the folder with theatrical disdain. These are nobodies, small-time operations. They can't handle a project of this scale. Their bids will be astronomical, and they'll never meet a deadline. Their bids are on average 12% higher, Clara conceded, but I've already drafted a proposal to establish an Ethelgard Restoration Trust. We can solicit private donations and apply for historical preservation grants, framing it as a civic good. I've spoken to the marketing department. They believe a documentary series on the restoration, focusing on these artisans, would generate national press and become a cornerstone of our sales campaign. It transforms a cost center into a profit-driving narrative. The value of that authenticity is incalculable. She paused, meeting his gaze. It builds a legacy. And isn't that the business we're in, Garrett? She had used their own language against them. Narrative, brand identity, value add. She had taken an argument about soul and translated it into the cold, hard calculus of profit. The other executives in the room, initially allied with Garrett, began to look at her folder with a new speculative interest. She had not just presented an alternative, she had presented a smarter, more lucrative one. The silence that followed was her first true victory. It was the moment they stopped seeing a waitress and started seeing a strategist. Eleanor, who had been observing the entire exchange from the head of the table without a word, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Pursue it," she said. And with those two words, the balance of power in the room had irrevocably shifted. Clara's greatest asset, however, was not in a boardroom. One crisp autumn Saturday, she drove her grandfather out to the Ethelgard estate. The construction site was quiet, the great manor house a skeletal shell amidst the raw, churned earth. She helped him from the car, his steps slow and careful on the uneven ground. He hadn't been on a real work site since his accident. He ran a gnarled hand over the original oak doorframe, his eyes closed. "Ah," he breathed, a scent of sawdust and old stories seeming to rise from the wood. "Quercus alba, white oak, from an old-growth forest by the feel of it. They don't have trees like this anymore. Look at the joinery. No nails, just pegs and skill. A man's pride is in this wood." He spent 2 hours moving through the house, touching, observing, reading the history of the structure with his fingertips. He pointed out the subtle sag in a floor beam, explaining how it could be corrected without being replaced. He identified the faint traces of a milk-based paint on the wall of what was once the library. He was not just seeing a building, he was communing with the spirits of the craftsmen who had built it. Clara recorded everything. His knowledge, raw and intuitive, was more valuable than any textbook or architectural survey. He was the soul of her project, the living embodiment of the authenticity she had fought for. That evening, she rewrote the entire restoration brief, peppering it with her grandfather's observations. It was no longer a technical document, it was a story, a conversation with the past. She sent it to Count Bellini. 2 days later, a package arrived from Florence. Inside was a small, leather-bound book and a handwritten note from the Count. "Miss Rossi, your brief was not a plan, it was a poem. It moved me deeply. You do not just understand buildings. You understand their ghosts. The enclosed is a small token of my esteem." The book was a first edition of Andrea Palladio's I Quattro Libri dell'Architettura, printed in 1570. It was a treasure of such immense cultural and monetary value that Clara's hands trembled as she held it. It was not a gift from a client to a contractor. It was a tribute from one connoisseur to another. The final phase of the Ethelgard project was the most perilous. It involved a complex rezoning petition with the city council, a process notoriously fraught with political maneuvering and backroom deals. Garrett insisted on handling it himself, claiming it required a delicate touch Clara couldn't possibly possess. He scheduled a key presentation before the zoning committee, pointedly excluding her from the planning meetings. Clara, sensing a trap, initiated her own back-channel research. Using the network of junior analysts who were now her loyal shadow army, she dug into the committee members' histories. She discovered that the committee chair, a formidable alderwoman named Alice Franklin, was the fiercest opponent of the project. Franklin represented a neighboring ward and viewed the Ethelgard development as an elitist enclave that would drive up property taxes without providing any community benefits. She was a populist champion, fiercely protective of her constituents. Garrett's plan was to overwhelm her with financial projections and legal arguments, a strategy Clara knew would be disastrous. On the day of the presentation, Clara entered the packed hearing room and took a seat in the public gallery, right behind the front row, reserved for community leaders from Alderwoman Franklin's district. When Garrett took the podium, he launched into a slick, jargon-filled presentation about tax revenues and property values. He was met with stony silence and hostile glares. As expected, Alderwoman Franklin tore his argument to shreds. "Mr. Shaw, your presentation is very impressive," she said, her voice dripping with acid. "But it tells my residents nothing, except that their neighborhood is about to be invaded by a luxury fortress for the 1%. You speak of profit. I speak of people. You have offered my community nothing." The room was on the verge of turning into a public execution. Garrett faltered, his smooth composure cracking. It was then that Eleanor Vance, seated in the front row, turned her head slightly and looked directly at Clara. It was not a command. It was an opening. Clara stood up. "Alderwoman Franklin, may I have a moment to speak?" A murmur went through the room. Franklin's eyes narrowed. "And you are?" "My name is Clara Rossi. I am the director of the Ethelgard Initiative for Van Sterling." Garrett shot her a look of pure fury. She had just usurped him in a public forum. "What my colleague failed to mention," Clara began, her voice clear and resonant, projecting to the back of the room, "is that the soul of this project is not exclusivity, but partnership. We have already established a charitable trust to ensure the manor and its gardens are open to the public. But we want to go further." She looked directly at the community leaders seated in front of her. "We know that the heart of your neighborhood is the Franklin Park Community Center, which has been underfunded for years. As part of our commitment to being good neighbors, Vance Sterling would like to announce a $5 million endowment for the center. Furthermore, we will partner with the center to establish a new vocational training program. The master artisans restoring the Ethelgard Manor will take on local apprentices, teaching them valuable, high-paying skills in historic preservation. We are not just building condos. We are committed to helping you preserve your own community's legacy." The stunned silence in the room was absolute. She had not only addressed the alderwoman's core objection, but had done so with a proposal so unexpected and transformative that it left no room for opposition. She had listened. She had understood. She had built a bridge. Alderwoman Franklin stared at her, her formidable political mask cracking for just a second to reveal a glimmer of profound respect. The vote, when it came, was unanimous in their favor. That evening, Clara was summoned to Eleanor's office. Garrett was already there, his face pale, his posture rigid. "Garrett," Eleanor said, her voice as cold as glacial ice, "your services are no longer required at this company. You will be given a generous severance package, conditional on a non-disclosure agreement of breathtaking scope and permanence. You fundamentally misunderstood the nature of our business. You thought we sold real estate. We sell a vision. You are dismissed." After he had gone, a diminished figure swallowed by the automatic doors, Eleanor gestured for Clara to look out the window. The city lights were beginning to glitter in the twilight, a galaxy of human ambition. 2 years ago, Eleanor said, her voice softer now, almost weary. "Before I met you, I stood here, and I realized I had built a perfect, gleaming, profitable machine, and I was becoming a ghost inside of it. I had forgotten the why. You reminded me." She turned to face Clara, and for the first time, Clara saw not a titan of industry, but a woman confronting her own legacy. "The board has approved my succession plan. I'm moving to the role of executive chairwoman. The position of chief executive officer is now vacant. It's yours, Clara, if you want it." Clara looked out at the sprawling city, no longer an intimidating map but a network of stories, a tapestry of lives. She thought of the waitress who had been invisible in a room full of powerful people. She had learned that true power wasn't about being seen, but about having the vision to see others. It wasn't about the language of contracts and spreadsheets, but about the ability to translate that language into one of hope, community, and human connection. Yes, she said, her voice not loud but as solid and unshakable as the bedrock beneath the city. Yes, I want it. On the opening night of the Ethelgard estate, 2 years later, the place was alive. The restored manor glowed, filled not with residents, but with the entire community, celebrating the unveiling of a new public art installation created by the first artist in residence. Count Bellini was there, standing beside Clara on the grand terrace, a flute of champagne in his hand. "You see," he said, his gaze sweeping over the diverse, joyful crowd, "a sonnet. You have built a sonnet of stone and steel, and most importantly, of people." Clara smiled, a deep, genuine smile of a woman who was finally completely at home in her own skin. Her grandfather was holding court by the fireplace, telling a group of rapt young architectural students about the hidden language of wood and stone. She looked toward the distant skyline, to the single point of light that was the pinnacle. It no longer seemed so high, so impossibly far away. It was just another building in a city she now knew was not built of concrete and ambition alone, but of the infinite interlocking stories of the lives within. Her own story was now one of them, a testament not to a fairy tale ending, but to the profound and transformative power of a single voice that dared to speak in a language the whole world was waiting to hear.